The headmaster's voice was like the voice of God. At the Montague School, the headmaster was God. "You there, Tompkinson minor, stop running. Bates, my office, 10 a.m. Be prepared to explain why you were studying the form on the 2:30 at Kempton during Latin 1 yesterday. In Latin, boy, since you're obviously so adept at the language that you no longer feel obliged to study it. You there, boy, what's your name?" And for the first time, or so I thought, I found his attentions turned upon me. "Jenkins, headmaster." "You boy, eh?" he said. "Yes, headmaster, scholarship student, headmaster." "Ah, Jenkins, the scholarship student," he nodded as if everything had suddenly slotted into place. "I trust you're not too intimidated by your surroundings, Jenkins, the scholarship student, after grammar school?" "A little, headmaster," I lied. The Montague School, with its mahogany walls, its elaborate busts, its legion of dead men in powdered wigs staring down from the walls, was the most intimidating place I'd ever encountered. "I shouldn't let it trouble you, Jenkins," said the headmaster. He placed a hand on my shoulder and gripped tightly. I could feel his fingers moving upon me, testing the small muscles beneath my blazer. "I feel certain that you're going to make a fine contribution to the Montague School. You know, in many ways, scholarship students are the lifeblood of this establishment." That morning, I saw the bones for the first time. The final-year boys were presented with them at assembly, each one stepping onto the stage in turn to receive a bone locked in a small velvet box. Their fathers had held the bones before them, and their fathers in turn, back for 400 years. It was an old Montague tradition, the ritual of the bone. I wondered then what would happen to me when I reached the sixth form. Would there be a bone in a red velvet box for me? I didn't see how there could be any for the scholarship boys, given the family traditions associated with them. But I was wrong. In a way, they were for all of us. 2 weeks later, I was standing in the rain watching a dispiriting rugby match between the first and second 15s when a small, untidy-looking boy with dirty blonde hair approached me. "Jenkins, isn't it?" said the boy. "Yes," I replied. "Why?" I tried to sound bored, but secretly I was quite grateful to be approached. "I'm Smethwick, the other scholarship student for this year." He smiled uneasily. "Crumbs, it's quite a place, isn't it? So big and old. You're homesick?" "A little," I admitted. "So was I at first," continued Smethwick. "But everyone's been very kind, even the older boys, and they're the ones who scared me the most." For a brief moment I was jealous of Smethwick. Why had the older boys spoken to him and not to me? What had Smethwick got that I had not? "Scared you?" I said. "Why?" "Oh, you know, in case they tried to bully me. And then there are the stories." "The stories?" I hadn't heard any stories. "Crikey, Jenkins, you're like an echo. The stories, you must have heard some of them." "They said that 5 years ago a scholarship boy died during some kind of prank. It was all hushed up, of course. They said he wandered off and got hit by a train. The story is he was dead before the train ever left the station." "You said stories," I said. "That means more than one." "Well," said Smethwick, "it's said there have been other accidents in the past. Some of them involved scholarship students, but local boys have died too, and once they found a boy from London down by the seashore, street urchin. He'd been torn up pretty badly on the rocks." Smethwick's face betrayed mingled terror and fascination. He giggled unattractively. "My father knew a man who used to keep a pub near here," he concluded. "He'd heard the stories." "Well, your father can't like you very much if he'd heard the stories and still sent you here." It was a cruel thing to say, but then it is in the nature of boys to be cruel. "Well, like my dad said, they're just stories," replied Smethwick nervously. "Probably put out to frighten people like us," he used to say. "Keep us from a proper education. We'd be all right." But we weren't. We weren't all right. They came for Smethwick 2 nights later. A long line of sixth formers, some with candles, all holding their little velvet box in their hands. They moved silently, and none of the other boys appeared to be awake to see them, or if they were, they chose not to reveal the fact. The sixth formers slapped their hands over Smethwick's mouth so he couldn't scream, while 4 or 5 of them carried him from his bed. I could see Smethwick thrashing in his pyjamas, his eyes wide with fear and panic. I should have left Smethwick to his fate, but I didn't. I was anxious to see what they were going to do to him. Pains me to say it, but I was glad that it was him instead of me. I followed the small group at a distance until it came to an oaken door bound with iron bands that stood open in a corner of the staff common room. The door was pulled close behind the group, but not locked. I opened it gently and felt the cool air. In front of me stone steps wound down, and in the quickly fading light from the candles of the sixth formers, I descended until I found myself in a huge cold room with stone walls and a low vaulted ceiling. There were more candles here and more figures waiting. I hid in the shadows behind a big candlestick and watched. On a raised stone platform at the end of the room stood the male teaching staff of the school. There was Bierce, the games master, and James, who taught Latin and Greek, and Jacobs and Burrage and Poe, and in front of them all stood Mr. Lovecraft, the headmaster, dressed in a red tartan nightgown with matching slippers. "Bring him forward, boys," said the headmaster. "Gently now, that's it. Tie him down well, Hyde. We don't want him running off on us, do we? Oh, do stop whimpering, Smethwick, it'll soon be over." They tied Smethwick to a slab of stone into which 4 iron rings had been set, binding his arms and his legs tightly to the rings with strong rope. Smethwick was wailing now, but nobody seemed to be paying him any attention, and the stone walls simply threw his cries back at him. "All right, you sixth form boys," said the headmaster, beckoning with his right hand. "Up you come, one at a time, you know what to do." The boys formed an orderly line facing the platform. On the floor beside Smethwick I could make out a pattern, perhaps a foot long and 6 inches wide. It looked like fossil remains, except it was concave, as if whatever fossil had once been encased there had been perfectly removed, leaving only the echo of what it had once been. And as I watched, each of the boys stepped forward, opened his little velvet box, and placed his bone in a section of the hollow pattern, filling it bit by bit until the skeletal remains of some kind of insect lay on the floor. I could see its rib cage, and a tiny pointed skull and a kind of short barbed tail that followed a groove in the stone. The headmaster smiled as the last bone was positioned, then removed a small ivory-handled knife from the pocket of his dressing gown. "Hyde, as head prefect, the honour of bleeding Smethwick falls to you." Hyde, a dark-haired, smug-looking youth, stepped forward in his brocade gown. He accepted the knife from the headmaster with a small bow, then turned to Smethwick. The cries of the spread-eagle boy rose an octave. "Please let me go," sobbed Smethwick. "Please, headmaster, I won't tell. Please, please, Hyde, don't hurt me." The headmaster shook his head in exasperation. "For goodness sake, Smethwick, stop whining. Be a man about it. It's no wonder your family never made anything of itself. Hyde's brother died at the Somme, leading a charge of 200 men. They all died too. Isn't that correct, Hyde? Hyde's the kind of chap that other men follow to their deaths. Who'd follow a whiner like you, Smethwick? Nobody, that's who. Hyde, continue, if you please." Hyde leaned over and made a long, deep incision in Smethwick's left arm. Smethwick immediately cried out in pain. Blood flowed quickly from the wound and dripped slowly onto the skeletal remains of the insect thing below. And as I watched, the strangest thing happened. A bloody membrane began to form over the creature. I saw veins and arteries appear, and a tiny dark heart began to pump blood. The bones on the beast's skeletal legs that lay curled over what had once been its abdomen now bonded and began to twitch, testing the air. A grey substance formed over its little skull as the spined tail moved on the stone with a thin, raking sound. The creature twisted where it lay, then coiled its body in on itself and stretched suddenly. The springing movement, ejecting it from its bed and bringing it to rest on the ends of its long, jointed legs. It stood about 10 inches tall, the skin on its back grey and semi-transparent, and sectioned like a caterpillar's. It raised its head, as if testing the air, and I caught a glimpse of a mouth, perhaps 1 inch or 2 in diameter, flanked at either side by small, thick palps. The headmaster took a careful step back, then raised his left hand like a conjurer displaying his latest illusion. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice quavering with pride, "I give you the school mascot." There was a round of applause from the assembled boys. Then the creature found at last the source of the dripping blood. It opened its jaws as the mouth expanded and contracted as it swallowed the drops. Then it tensed its body again, its abdomen lowering until it almost touched the ground, and sprang up onto the slab. I heard Smethwick scream as the thing scuttled across his chest, arched its back, and with a single thrust latched onto his neck. Then slowly the body of the creature began to throb as it sucked the life from the boy, its horrid form expanding to store the blood of the unfortunate Smethwick. I watched until, sated, The thing drew away from Smethwick and staggered slowly onto the slab itself. Smethwick lay unmoving, his eyes open and his face pale. His left hand spasmed once, twice, then was still. Gingerly, the headmaster lifted the beast by its sides and raised it high into the air, its legs flailing gently and blood dripping from its jaws. "By this ritual of the bones, we are bonded together, all complicit, all united, in the great family that is our class," he declared. "Generations of great men have learned their most valuable lesson from this little creature. The blood of the lower classes is also our lifeblood. Without it, we cannot be great, and if we cannot be great, our country cannot be great. Now 3 cheers for the Montague School." All of the boys shouted hip hip hooray as the headmaster lowered the creature and placed it in its small cage, then handed the cage to Mr. Burridge. "You know what to do, Burridge," he said. "In a few days it'll be skin and bone again. Then you can disassemble it and put the pieces back into the boxes for next year's boys." Mr. Burridge held the cage away from his body and stared at its occupant, now drowsy and heavy with blood. "It is the damnedest thing, isn't it, Ed?" For the first time, what might have been disgust showed itself on the headmaster's face. "Indeed it is the damnedest thing. Hyde, you and 2 boys take Smethwick here and dispose of him. I suggest a walk along the cliffs, but be sure to weigh him down before you drop him off. Now Mr. Bierce will lead you all in a chorus of the school song." But I didn't wait to hear it. I ran back to my room and packed my bags, and by morning I was gone. My parents were surprised to see me and wanted to take me back. I cried and screamed until they relented. I think perhaps that my mother guessed that something was very wrong, although she never said anything about it, and I never told her what I'd witnessed. After all, who would believe me? And so a letter was sent to Mr. Lovecraft announcing my withdrawal from the school. 1 week later he came to the house to visit. My mother gave him tea and scones, but politely declined to return me to his care. "We'll be sorry to lose him, Mrs. Jenkins," he said at last, as he shrugged on his long blue overcoat. "He could have made a wonderful contribution to the school. New boys are our lifeblood, you know." My mother gave me a push in the small of the back, and I was compelled to follow the dark form of Mr. Lovecraft to the garden gate. As he opened it, he paused and looked closely at me. "As I told your mother, Jenkins, we're sorry to lose you." Suddenly he leaned forward and gripped my shoulder, and once again I could feel those fingers working at my flesh. "But mark my words, Jenkins, in the end, you can't escape your destiny. One way or another, we'll have you, because, Jenkins, like all members of your sturdy, loyal class, you're full of the stuff that makes Britain great."